Part 51. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 501. There was clearly a hint of contempt in the eyes of the middle-aged man. He just turned his head and glanced at Zhuang Yudi, with a slight curl of anger at the corner of his mouth. Sneer. Xiaonizai, I don't know what level you are, but I can tell you clearly that I have an epic guardian beast. Do you know what this epic level represents? The middle-aged man's eyes were fixed directly on Zhuang Yudi, and there was a faint smile on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of ridicule. At this time, after Zhuang Yudi heard what the middle-aged man said, a sneer appeared on the corner of her mouth, and a bit of coldness flashed in her eyes. You're just a mere epic level beast master. I really don't understand why you are so proud. After the middle-aged man heard what Zhuang Yudi said, he was furious, and then he suddenly took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Zhuang Yudi. On the body. Xiaonizai, don't think that you are a woman and I won't touch you, but you are talking arrogantly and uncontrollably here. Do you believe it or not, if you anger me, I will even dare to kill you. The middle-aged man took a direct step forward, and the powerful aura on his body was revealed. After everyone saw this scene, a flash of light flashed in their eyes. The solemn meaning. At this time, only Zhuang Yudi looked indifferent. She just shook her head, and then glanced coldly at the middle-aged man, with the corners of her mouth curling up. There was a bit of a sneer, and a bit of murderous intent flashed in his eyes. It's true that all the cats and dogs are sent here. Since you want to die, it would be really unreasonable if I don't help you. After Zhuang Yudi finished speaking, the cold aura on his body was fully revealed, and a majestic and vast power spurted out, and the surrounding world began to move bit by bit. Then the colorful bird suddenly appeared behind Zhuang Yudi. Exotic beast, colorful bird epic level 9, level 49. Qualification, alien, intermediate. Life, 9999999999777. Speed, 9999999999777. Defense, 9999999999777. Attack, 9999999999777. Skills, charming posture, alluring dance, thousands of ice rain, frozen heaven and earth. Charming posture, the colorful sparrow activates its skills and can charm the enemy with every move. Dance of the alluring city, the colorful sparrow activates its skills and uses its charming dance to absorb the soul of the enemy. It is an extremely rare soul type attack, but it is ineffective against beasts of the same level or higher than itself. 10,000 feet of icy rain, the colorful divine sparrow activates its skill, and with a thought, a 10-foot-long icy rain instantly freezes the world, making everyone's souls tremble. Frozen world, the colorful divine sparrow activates its skills and uses ice attribute elements to completely freeze the world and form an ice and snow domain. In this ice and snow domain, the colorful divine sparrow is the absolute master. At this time, after seeing this scene, the middle-aged man couldn't help but frown slightly, and his eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi. The corners of his eyes and eyebrows were full of disbelief. With a look on his face, he never expected that Zhuang Yudi would already have such a terrifying beast at such a young age. Zhuang Yudi stared at the middle-aged man with a smile on her face. The gloomy murderous aura in her body was clearly revealed at this moment, and the sneer at the corner of her mouth began to become more and more obvious. Stand up. How about it? I don't know what your guardian beast is. Aren't you going to release it for everyone to take a look at? Zhuang Yudi's eyes were fixed directly on the middle-aged man. The sneer at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and there was quite a bit of mockery in his eyes. Meaning. At this time, after hearing what Zhuang Yudi said, the middle-aged man felt that the blood all over his body was surging. His eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi, with a gloomy killing intent. At this moment, it is even more obvious. Xiaonizai, Don't think that you are so powerful just because you have an epic guardian beast. In the face of combat experience, it is absolutely impossible for a young girl like you to be my opponent. The middle-aged man let out a roar, "Blood python, come out." At this time, a giant python with light blue scales all over its body suddenly appeared in front of everyone. The scales of the giant python stood upside down like sharp knives. And not only that, there were two small bulges faintly visible on the python's head, and it looked like it was about to turn into a dragon. At this time, the smile at the corner of the middle-aged man's mouth began to become more and more obvious, and there was a bit of mockery in his eyes. Alien Beast, Blood Python Epic Level 3, Level 49. Qualification, Alien, Low Level. Life, 9999999999777. Speed, 9999999999777. Defense, 9999999999777. Attack, 9999999999777. Skills, Blood Python Rage, Blood Python Swallowing the Sky, Bloody Domain. Blood Python Rage, Blood Python Flood Dragon activates skills and mobilizes its own blood in this instant. It can achieve tremendous power, killing intent, and blood everywhere. Blood Python Swallowing the Sky, Blood Python Flood Dragon activates skills and uses its own powerful physique to forcibly swallow the enemy's attacks, but it can only swallow the attacks of strong people of the same level as itself. If it swallows people of higher levels than itself, it will be in danger of exploding. Bloody Domain, Blood Python Flood Dragon activates skills and summons its own domain. In this domain, the level of Blood Python Flood Dragon increases by 1 level, and the speed and strength increase to 5 times the previous level, and the strength of the body increases to 10 times the original level. And at this time, when the Blood Python Flood Dragon appeared, everyone just smelled a faint smell of blood around it. After seeing this scene, Juan Yudi's lips curled up into a faint smile, and her eyes were full of mockery. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 502. And at this time, Bao Si walked out slowly. Her lazy voice was very charming. "What's going on? What's going on? Why has it suddenly become so noisy? Isn't it time for people to have a good rest?" When Bao Si came out, almost everyone's eyes were focused on Bao Si. These men, without exception, had a sense of surprise in the corners of their eyes and brows. Even the middle-aged man was no exception. At this time, after Juan Yudi saw this scene, she was just annoyed and rolled her eyes at the group of people. There was a bit of a sneer at the corner of her mouth, and there was a complete look in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. Kind of contempt. A bunch of pig brothers are so ridiculous. At this time, Bao Si seemed to have heard what Juan Yudi said. He just smiled and shook his head. He didn't say anything more. Bao Si slowly walked towards Juan Yudi. "Come over. Is this your friend?" Juan Yudi just snorted coldly, and then waved her hand casually, "No." After Bao Si heard what Juan Yudi said, a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of her mouth, and there was a bit of teasing in her eyes. "Since they are not your friends, then invite them out." After Zhao Qinghuan saw this scene, he quickly came out to smooth things over. At this time, Zhao Qinghuan just turned his head, glanced in their direction, and then said with a smile on his face, "Don't be angry, don't be angry. There are some things that you can't be angry about, you can't be angry at." Bao Si and Juan Yudi looked at each other like this, with a bit of a sneer on the corners of their mouths, and a bit of mockery in their eyes. "Really? But I wonder if you haven't figured out who is here? And Juan Yudi told you this news? Is this your attitude?" Although Juan Yudi and Bao Si occasionally quarreled on weekdays, they became extremely unified at this moment. After Zhao Qinghuan saw this scene, he was about to cry for a while. At this time, Zhao Qinghuan just coughed lightly, and then said in a deep voice. This matter is indeed our fault. It is indeed our fault. Please don't get angry. At this moment, Bao Si and Zhuang Yudi also had a bit of sneer on their lips, and then they waved their hands casually. Forget it, since you are also the first offenders, let's just forget about this Danja incident. The two of them just looked at each other, and then smiled. At this moment, the middle-aged man suddenly took a step forward behind Zhao Qinghuan. We can't just let this matter go. After Zhao Qinghuan saw this scene, his brows seemed to be knitted together, and he was thinking in his heart at this time. Why did the superiors send such an ignorant guy back like this? Damn it! Zhao Qinghuan was also speechless for a while, and in the corners of his eyes and brows, there was a sense of helplessness. At this moment, he coughed lightly, and a gloomy look flashed in his eyes. Wu Yudao, let's forget this matter. After all, Zhuang Yudi is much younger than you, so don't get along with her. At this time, Wu Yudao just snorted coldly, and then turned his head and glanced towards Zhao Qinghuan. A gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and his face was even more so. A cold. It's not impossible not to argue with him. Ask him to come over and apologize to me. Just apologize to me and let it go. If she still has the same attitude as now, then this matter will never be over. Wu Yudao said in a cold voice. The murderous intention in his body was even more awe-inspiring, and a slight sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, Zhao Qinghuan's eyes were full of helplessness. Zhao Qinghuan turned his head and glanced at Zhuang Yudi, with a wry smile on his lips. Look. After Zhuang Yudi heard what Zhao Qinghuan said, she turned her head and glanced towards Zhao Qinghuan. The smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious, and in her eyes a bit of gloom flashed through. What am I looking at? What do you want to say? Zhuang Yudi's eyes were fixed on Zhao Qinghuan, and there was a faint smile on the corner of her mouth. There was a gloomy look in her eyes. The killing intent arose even more fiercely. At this time, Zhao Qinghuan was about to cry for a while. He just coughed lightly. Ahem, this matter is originally the fault of both of you, and Brother Tao is also an old man after all. At this time, before Zhao Qinghuan finished speaking, a cold light flew directly to her ear. At this time, a blood mark was drawn on Zhao Qinghuan's face, and the blood slowly flowed down her cheek. Flowed out. At this time, Zhuang Yudi was staring at Zhao Qinghuan with a smile on her face, a faint smile on her lips, and a hint of teasing in her eyes. I'm sorry, what did you say just now? I don't think I heard it clearly. Zhao Qinghuan's face was a little ugly, his eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi. At this time he just took a deep breath, and then calmed down a little. Okay, very good, I don't care about the matter between you two, this matter will be solved by you two. After Zhao Qinghuan finished speaking, he just walked away. At this time, Wu Yudao and Zhuang Yudi looked at each other, and Zhuang Yudi pointed outside. What do you think? Do you dare to go out and compete? At this time, after Wu Yudao heard Zhuang Yudi say this, the smile on the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious, his eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi, and a bit of mockery flashed in his eyes. I wish I could. At this time, the two of them stood up suddenly after they finished speaking, and then walked out. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 503. At this time, the blood python and the seven-colored divine bird suddenly flew out, and then the two beasts fought directly together. The two beasts fought hard and hard. In just a moment, they sat in meditation. The auras around them flew up and down and moved left and right. Those auras were extremely powerful and vast, but fortunately, the people around them were already used to it, so they didn't notice anything wrong. Just a moment later, the powerful force suddenly rushed into the sky, and then the vast force around them began to churn. Between one breath and another, the surrounding scene became quiet. After waiting for a moment, the blood python let out an angry howl, and then the blood python suddenly bit the seven-colored divine bird. At this time, the seven-colored divine bird was bitten on the wing by the blood python, which was obviously caused by the lack of combat experience of the seven-colored divine bird. At this time, Wu Yudao's eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi, and the sneer at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and his eyes were full of mockery. "How is it? What do you have to say now?" Wu Yudao's eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi, and the sneer at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and his eyes were full of mockery. At this time, after hearing what Wu Yudao said, Zhuang Yudi suddenly laughed. Zhuang Yudi's eyes were fixed on Wu Yudao, and a cold aura emanated from Zhuang Yudi. "Interesting, really interesting, the best is yet to come, don't worry," Zhuang Yudi said slowly, and at this time Wu Yudao suddenly had a bad feeling in his heart. At this moment, a force of ice slowly spread along the blood python's mouth, and then the blood python was completely frozen almost at the same time. But Zhuang Yudi still left a glimmer of hope for the blood python, and the blood python fell heavily. At this time, the sneer on Zhuang Yudi's mouth became more and more obvious, and his eyes flashed with a bit of mockery. "What? Are you satisfied?" When Wu Yudao saw this scene, he was shocked. Then he felt his blood surging and a mouthful of blood gushed out. His eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi, and his eyes were full of surprise. "What? How is it possible? How could it be like this?" Zhuang Yudi just glanced at Wu Yudao coldly. The smile on his lips became more and more obvious. His eyes were full of contempt. "How?" Wu Yudao was trembling all over. His eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi, and his eyes were full of unwillingness. "Asshole, damn it!" Zhuang Yudi couldn't help but laugh at that time. "If you apologize to me now, I might consider releasing your blood python, but you don't have much time. If you don't apologize within a quarter of an hour, your blood python will be completely dead," Zhuang Yudi said slowly, and the smile on the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious, and there was a mocking look in her eyes and eyebrows. At this time, Wu Yudao seemed to have aged more than 10 years. Wu Yudao turned his head and looked at Zhuang Yudi, then sighed heavily. His eyes were full of unwillingness, and then he gritted his teeth and said, "Yes, I'm sorry, this matter is all my fault, it's all my fault," Wu Yudao said coldly at this time. At this time, Zhuang Yudi stared at Wu Yudao with a smile on her face, then frowned slightly and shook her head. "Why are you speaking so softly? I can't hear you clearly." Wu Yudao stared at Zhuang Yudi with a look of unwillingness. "You, don't go too far." Zhuang Yudi's eyes flashed with a bit of gloom, her eyes were fixed on Wu Yudao, and a bit of sneer appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Am I going too far?" Zhuang Yudi's eyes flashed with a bit of gloomy murderous intent. At this time, Wu Yudao's face instantly became ugly after seeing Zhuang Yudi's eyes at this moment, and then he quickly waved his hand and shook his head. "Not too much, not too much." After hearing what Wu Yudao said, Zhuang Yudi's smile became more and more obvious. A hint of mockery flashed in her eyes, and then she frowned slightly. "If it's not too much, then what else do you have to say?" Zhuang Yudi's voice was a little low and hoarse. It was obvious that she was angry about what happened just now, so she was like this. However, the reason why Zhuang Yudi refused to give in was to gain command of the team, because there was a very important thing that Zhuang Yudi had to get. At this time, Wu Yudao retreated several steps to the back, and then he barely stabilized his body. Wu Yudao's face was a little pale, and then he nodded lightly. After a while, after Wu Yudao apologized to Zhuang Yudi very seriously, Zhuang Yudi's mind moved, and then the blood python was thawed directly. At this time, Zhuang Yudi saw the scene and nodded with satisfaction. The corners of her mouth even raised a few faint smiles, and there was a bit of teasing in her eyes. At this time, Wu Yudao's eyes were fixed on Zhuang Yudi, and there was a sense of unwillingness in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, but at this time he did not dare to show any expression. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 504. At this time, Lin Yu and Su Weiner arrived in the city. The scene in the city was quite normal, at least there was nothing wrong. Su Weiner turned her head and stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, and a few meaningful smiles appeared at the corners of her mouth. Lin Yu was quite curious when he saw Su Weiner like this, so at this time he turned his head and glanced at Su Weiner, with a bit of confusion flashing in his eyes. "You little girl, why are you staring at me like this?" At this time, Amelia Su just smiled and said, "Isn't it okay to look at you like this?" At this time, Su Weiner also stuck out her tongue so playfully, a hint of playfulness flashed in her eyes, and the smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious. After Lin Yu heard what Su Weiner said, he just coughed lightly, and then shook his head. "Ahem, did you, little girl, find something?" Su Weiner just snorted coldly, and then glanced at Lin Yu. "Don't hold it here, you know how to pretend to be confused, haven't you noticed that the smell of powder here is very strong?" The streets around here were almost full of beautifully dressed women, but there was not a single man on the streets around here. When those women saw Lin Yu, they looked at Lin Yu with smiles on their faces. Get started. However, Lin Yu, who was used to seeing beautiful women, naturally couldn't take these vulgar fans lightly. At this time, he just coughed lightly. "Ahem, this." After Su Weiner heard what Lin Yu said, she also snorted coldly, and then others rolled their eyes at Lin Yu angrily. "You still have the nerve to say it, look at your eyes now, it's almost growing on my body." At this time, Lin Yu just smiled and didn't say much. After walking forward for a while, in the middle of the city, there was actually not the city lord's palace, but an inn. However, this inn looked quite normal, but it looked larger than ordinary inns. Much bigger. Although this inn is not small, there are really not many guests in this inn, just 2 or 3 scattered tables. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he didn't know why, but he always felt that something was not normal in this inn. At this time, he half squinted his eyes, and then raised his eyebrows slightly. "It's strange. I don't know why. I always feel that there is something weird in this inn. I just don't know if this is my imagination," Lin Yu just said softly. At this time, after Su Weiner heard what Lin Yu said, a bit of solemnity flashed in her eyes. "What's going on? How can the business of such a big inn be so bad? There must be something fishy in this." Lin Yu nodded slightly. "What you said is half true, so it's better to be careful and don't make any trouble." Lin Yu spoke softly like this, and at this time, after Su Weiner heard Lin Yu say this, she nodded so heavily, with a bit of solemnity in her eyes. At this time, after the two people finished talking, Lin Yu and Su Weiner walked into the inn. After they entered the inn, the landlady slowly walked out of the back room. The landlady's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and she walked towards Lin Yu with a smile on her face. "I wonder what this guest would like to order." The landlady's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, a faint smile appeared on the corner of her mouth, and there was a hint of teasing in her eyes. At this time, Lin Yu also coughed lightly. "Ahem, 3 kilograms of beef, a jar of wine, and 2 side dishes." When the lady boss heard what Lin Yu said, she nodded her head, smiled, and then turned around and left. After a while, the proprietress brought a plate of beef and some side dishes. A waiter held a jar of wine in his hand and another side dish. The waiter in the shop is powerful, has a steady pace, and has a steady breath. You can tell at a glance that he is a practitioner. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on that person, and there was a certain solemnity in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, the landlady glanced at Lin Yu, and then said with a smile, "I wonder if your guest is satisfied." Lin Yu heard this. After the landlady said this, a complicated meaning flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. He turned his head and glanced at the landlady. Boss, there is something I want to ask you." At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the landlady's eyes flashed with confusion, and then she stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face. "I don't know what you want to ask me, sir." Lin Yu coughed lightly, and then said softly, "It's not a big deal, it's just that there seems to be something strange in our city. What's going on?" Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the proprietress, and a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the proprietress turned around and looked at Lin Yu carefully. "Sir, you should be an outsider." At this time, after hearing what the proprietress said, Lin Yu was also slightly stunned at first, and then nodded. "Yes, it is indeed an outsider. What's wrong? Is there any problem?" After hearing what Lin Yu said, the proprietress just smiled, and then nodded gently. "So that's why, no wonder, no wonder." After hearing what the boss lady said, Lin Yu couldn't help but frown slightly. "What's wrong?" The boss lady smiled slightly. "You don't know, all the young and middle-aged people here have been forced to do hard labor, so only this woman is left at home." Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 505. Lin Yu heard this, and after the landlady said this, his expression also condensed slightly, and then he turned his head, glanced at the landlady, and then whispered like this. "But even so, it's not like doing this kind of business." After the lady boss heard what Lin Yu said, she also had a bit of a wry smile on her lips. Her eyes were full of helplessness. She turned her head and stared straight at Lin Yu's body. "Sir, do you think that if we had any way to avoid doing this kind of business, would we do this?" At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the landlady said, he was like a monk who was confused, and there was a kind of confusion in the corners of his eyes and brows. "I don't quite understand what you said." The landlady just waved her hand casually, and then sighed heavily. "Oh, let me tell you the truth. You have also seen that there is no fertile farmland around here, and we have no way to go hunting at all, so if we don't do this kind of business, we will probably starve to death. Do you think we are hungry? Is it better to die, or—" After the landlady said this, she suddenly choked up. At this time, Lin Yu was stunned and didn't know what to say. Lin Yu's brows were like this, as if they were twisted together. At this time, he just sighed heavily, with a bit of a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and there was a kind of expression between his brows. The feeling of helplessness. Yes, at least live without shame. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the landlady. At this time, the corner of the landlady's mouth also evoked a bit of a bitter smile, and there was a look of helplessness in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. "Sir, I won't say much else. Anyway, as long as you can understand good." Lin Yu nodded, and then sighed quietly. Alas, every family has problems that are difficult to recite, things that are impossible to do, and things that can't be helped. After Lin Yu said this, there was a bit of a wry smile on the corner of his mouth, and there was a bit of helplessness in his eyes. After waiting for a while, the landlady walked up to Lin Yu. Then, "Guess, sir, look at now." Lin Yu waved his hand gently. "It's okay, you will open 2 high-end rooms for me in a moment." After the lady boss heard what Lin Yu said, she turned around and left. Looking at the lady boss's still charming appearance, she knew that she must have been a very popular beauty when she was young. It's just that now, Zuyan Saijing has probably fallen into such a state of decline. Although she is quite a bit aloof, the integrity between her eyebrows seems to have never changed. After Lin Yu thought of this, there was a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. At this time, Su Weiner remained silent, not knowing what she was thinking. When Lin Yu saw Suwaner like this, he turned his head and glanced in Suwaner's direction, with a bit of confusion flashing in his eyes. "How are you?" When Suwaner heard what Lin Yu said, she was also slightly startled, and then nodded lightly. "They are all pitiful people, they are all pitiful people." Suwaner's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, with a somewhat strange color in her eyes. At this time, Lin Yu heard Suwaner's words and nodded lightly. After waiting for a while, a group of fierce-looking men rushed in. After the group of fierce-looking men broke in, they just looked around and then said in a cold voice. Said, "Which of you is the boss? Get out of here." At this time, after hearing what they said, the landlady did not dare to hesitate for a moment and walked out with a smile on her face. The landlady turned her head and looked around at them. Then he spoke softly. "I don't know, gentlemen, what's the matter with you?" The leader, a one-eyed dragon wearing an eye patch, walked up to the landlady and stared at her with a smile on his face. The smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. After the lady boss saw that person, she suddenly felt a bad premonition in her heart. At this time, the lady boss subconsciously took a few steps back. The one-eyed dragon snorted coldly. He just glared fiercely at the landlady. A cold light flashed in his eyes, and the gloomy look on his body began to become more and more obvious. "Stand up." "What? Are you afraid of me?" The one-eyed dragon's eyes were fixed on the boss's wife. At this time, the boss's wife was also on the verge of crying, but she naturally did not dare to say nonsense at this moment. The landlady quickly waved her hands and shook her head. "No, no." The one-eyed dragon took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the landlady. "If not, then you have to accompany me well today." The one-eyed dragon's eyes were fixed on the proprietress, and the smile on the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, the proprietress walked to the side of the one-eyed dragon, and her eyes were fixed on the one-eyed dragon. "Sir, please don't be angry first, what do you want?" "I will listen to you, isn't it okay?" The proprietress's eyes were fixed on the one-eyed dragon, and a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of her mouth, and there was a bit of teasing in her eyes. At this time, the one-eyed dragon gently lifted the proprietress's chin, and a bit of playfulness flashed in his eyes. "Ha ha ha, you are still sensible. I have so many brothers, come to your place, don't you make good arrangements for them?" After the proprietress heard what the one-eyed dragon said, a bit of solemnity flashed in her eyes, and then her eyes were fixed on the one-eyed dragon, and a bit of bitter smile appeared on the corner of her mouth. "Sir, I am just a small business owner. Please be gracious and let me go." "How about that?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 506. When the one-eyed dragon heard what the landlady said, he gently raised the landlady's chin, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. There was a hint of ridicule in his eyes, and then he tightened his breath. Then he slapped the landlady directly on the face. "Did I show too much shame to you just now? Could it be that you didn't understand what I said?" The one-eyed dragon's eyes were fixed on the proprietress, a gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and the murderous aura on his body was even more awe-inspiring. At this time, the landlady also shook her head. "No, no, no, I can understand, I can understand." At this time, the landlady was even crying. A sneer appeared at the corner of the one-eyed dragon's mouth, and then he nailed the landlady with a smile. "It's good if you can understand it. If you can understand it, what should you do next? You don't need me to teach you." The one-eyed dragon's eyes stared directly at the landlady, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, the proprietress swallowed her saliva, and then nodded her head like a chicken pecking at rice. I understand, I understand, I don't need you to teach me, I don't need you to teach me. After the proprietress finished speaking, she waved her hand gently, and then the waiter behind him was greeted by the proprietress. Do you have any orders? The proprietress glared at the waiter fiercely. Why are you so blind? Why don't you hurry up and serve these gentlemen with good wine and good food? The waiter in the shop heard it, and after the landlady said this, he nodded slightly, and then walked towards the back. At this time, the proprietress turned her head and stared directly at the one-eyed dragon. At this time, the one-eyed dragon hugged the proprietress over, and his hands suddenly began to act dishonestly. But at this time, the landlady also dared to be angry but dared not say anything. She did not dare to say anything at all. The one-eyed dragon was laughing like this at the moment. He gently lifted the boss's chin, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. I didn't expect the promotion to be so beautiful. I'm in a good mood today. How about having a few drinks with me? Naturally, the landlady didn't dare to say no, so at this time, the landlady had no choice but to nod her head. Just like that, the two of them began to drink one sip at a time. As they pushed the cups to the cup, the face of the landlady was already crawling. Added 2 touches of crimson color. At this time, the one-eyed dragon didn't say anything, and directly hugged the boss's wife on the table. The boss's wife struggled desperately, but at this time, the one-eyed dragon just laughed like this. At this moment, Lin Yu on the side saw the scene and stood up suddenly. At this moment, the one-eyed dragon discovered Lin Yu in the corner, and of course Su Weiner beside Lin Yu. How could this group of horse thieves have ever seen a beauty like Su Weiner? So at this time, they were stunned by Su Weiner's beauty. They were also stunned for a moment. Their eyes were staring straight at her. Su Weiner's body and eyes were quite aggressive. My little beauty, she is doing well, but I don't know if this little beauty can be used for my enjoyment. The one-eyed dragon's eyes were staring straight at Su Weiner, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, Su Weiner immediately jumped up, her eyes fixed on the one-eyed dragon, and a gloomy murderous intention began to spread. You bastard, if you dare to look around again, believe it or not, I will gouge out your eyeballs. At this time, after hearing what Su Weiner said, the one-eyed dragon even sneered a bit at the corner of his mouth. His eyes were full of mockery, and the murderous aura on his body was even more terrifying. However, gouge out my eyeballs, ha 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 ha, okay, I want to see how you can gouge out my eyeballs. As long as sister, you come into my arms, then I will take the initiative to take out my eyeballs. How about giving it to you? At this time, Su Weiner glanced at Lin Yu, and then said in a cold voice, I can't bear it anymore. After Lin Yu heard what Su Weiner said, a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and there was a hint of teasing in his eyes. You can't bear it anymore, do you think I can bear it? After hearing what Lin Yu said, Su Weiner's eyes and brows were filled with a sense of excitement. At this time, Su Weiner jumped up and slapped the table, and then a long sword suddenly came out. Suddenly it came into her palm. No one could feel the terrifying aura on Su Weiner's body at all, so the situation between Su Weiner and Su Weiner was a bit ridiculous. At this time, Su Weiner was furious after seeing the smiles of everyone around her. At this time, she suddenly jumped up, raised her sword towards the group of people, and suddenly rushed over. Su Weiner's speed was extremely fast, and she was already in front of them in just one breath. But the bandits obviously didn't take Su Weiner seriously at this time, and Malu didn't even move. He just glanced at a rather burly man. Just teach her a lesson, don't hurt this little beauty, I'll be useful to her later. After Malu said this, the smile on the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. At this time, the rather burly man stood up directly, and then suddenly jumped up and rushed towards Su Weiner. At this time, the burly man wanted to grab the sword in Suwaner's hand with his bare hands. After all, it was not difficult for him to catch the sword with his bare hands, especially the sword of an ordinary person. For Ma-san, it was too easy to take the next blow. At this time, Ma-san's eyes were fixed on Suwaner, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. "My little beauty, why are you asking for trouble here? As the saying goes, there is a road to heaven but you don't take it, and there is no door to hell but you come here on your own." Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 507. At this time, there was only a sneer at the corner of Suwaner's mouth, her eyes were full of mockery, and there was a complete look of contempt in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. "Stupid guy, you will regret it." After Suwaner finished speaking, everyone saw a flash of cold light. At this time, Ma-saner even consciously took a chance. Then Ma-saner felt that something seemed wrong about this matter, and his face changed slightly. He twisted it, and then saw that all his 5 fingers were cut off. At this moment, Ma-saner, who pointed to Liansing at this moment, let out a scream. After Malu saw this scene, his face was as gloomy as if it could drip water. His eyes were fixed on Suwaner's body, and his gloomy murderous intention was even more revealed at this moment. "Out! Xiaonazai, I didn't expect you to be quite capable, but so what? Now you dare to hurt my brother. If I don't kill you today, I will feel uneasy." Malu jumped up to slap the case, and then he stood on the table in an instant. At this time, Malu's eyes were fixed on Suwaner, and a cold murderous intention began to spread. "Out!" At this moment, behind Malu, a sky-swallowing monkey revealed its figure. At this time, Malu's eyes were staring straight at Suwaner. The smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious, and his eyes were full of mockery. "Color. Ha 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 ha, woman, you are going to die today," I said, "no one can keep you." Malu almost said this through gritted teeth. At this time, after Suwaner heard what Malu said, her face turned slightly ugly. Her eyes were fixed on Malu. After a moment, she suddenly smiled. "Ha ha ha, it's interesting. It's really interesting. I've seen people who daydream, but I've never seen anyone who dares to daydream like you. Since you want to seek death, it would be really unjustifiable if I don't help you today." After Suwaner finished speaking, the mysterious vaginal beast suddenly appeared behind Suwaner. The mysterious vaginal beast took a step forward. After seeing this scene, the sky-swallowing monkey's face instantly became ugly. Getting up, the sky-swallowing monkey took a few steps back. There was a sense of complete panic in the corners of his eyes and brows. You must know that this sky-swallowing monkey has just entered the epic level. Although it can be said to be dominant in this area, in front of Suwaner, it is nothing at all. At this time, after seeing this scene, Malu's face instantly became ugly. Malu's eyes stared directly at Suwaner, and his face instantly became ugly. At this time, Suwaner took a step forward, her eyes were fixed on Malu, and the smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious. "What? Didn't you just keep saying that you wanted to teach me a lesson? Now I am willing to give you this opportunity. You are a mule or a horse? Take it out for a walk." Suwaner just stared at Malu with a smile on her face. At this time, Malu took several steps back and then managed to stabilize his figure. Malu never expected that the ordinary-looking woman in front of him would have such strength. At this time, Malu took a deep breath, calmed down his mood a little, and then spoke in a deep voice. "Just wait here and see if I dare to kill you." Malu's voice trembled slightly, and at this time, Suwaner was staring at Malu with a smile on her face, and the mysterious vaginal beast even let out an angry sound in Malu's direction. Roared. At this time, Malu began to realize that the woman in front of him did not seem to be simple. At this time, Lin Yu on the side just took a sip of the tea in his cup, and then spoke in a deep voice. Okay, let's have some fun and get rid of this guy. Don't go too far, it's no fun. After Suwanner heard what Lin Yu said, she nodded slightly, and then as soon as her thoughts moved, the mysterious vagina spit out a mouthful of turbid air. That breath of mysterious turbid air directly enveloped the sky-swallowing monkey. The sky-swallowing monkey let out screams one after another. In just a moment, he was completely overwhelmed by that breath. Devoured. At this time, Malu suffered even more backlash. His face turned pale for a while, and a mouthful of blood spurted out from his mouth. His face instantly became ugly. Malu struggled to stand up like this, his eyes fixed on Suwanner, and his brows seemed to be knitted together. Xiaonazai, I bet you are cruel. If you have the guts, just wait here and don't run away. My elder brother will come here in a while, and he will definitely make you walk around without food. Malu said in a cold voice. The murderous intent in his eyes became more and more obvious, and the murderous intent in his body became even more awe-inspiring. At this time, after hearing what Malu said, Suwanner just raised a few sneers at the corners of her mouth, and her eyes were full of mockery. Okay, since you have said this, then I will wait for you. Malu stared at Suwanner, and then he glanced coldly at the group of people behind him, and then said in a deep voice. What are you waiting for here? Hurry up, wait for the big brother to come, and then teach this little girl a lesson. After hearing what Malu said, the group of people nodded in agreement, and then turned around and ran away. At this time, the boss lady came to the two of them, turned her head, looked at the two of them, and her eyes flashed with a bit of complexity. I am very grateful to you for helping me out this time, but those guys are extraordinary, you should leave quickly. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 508. But at this moment, the group of people ran wildly towards the outside. At this time, they were in a panic and did not dare to stay for a moment, as if they were afraid that Suwanner, the murderer, was chasing them out. Lin Yu heard this. After the landlady said this, he just stood up slowly and glanced at the landlady. There was a faint smile on the corner of his mouth, but there was quite a bit of emotion in his eyes. A bit of a joke. It doesn't matter, these guys ran away, but even if they ran away, it's impossible for the Monkey King to escape from the palm of the Tathagata Buddha. Lin Yu spoke unhurriedly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. The landlady just shook her head. They are horse thieves from the nearby mountains. They know that there are no soldiers guarding the city in our city, and the men in every household have been captured because of the corvée, so they will often come from the city to plunder. If they can afford to prepare something, they can return it well. If they can't prepare anything, then I'm afraid they. The lady boss paused immediately after saying this, and then she started crying. I have several friends who were taken away by them and never came back. I don't know what happened, let alone whether the world has changed or everything has changed. After the landlady said this, she also sighed heavily. The bitter smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious, and there was a kind of helplessness in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but clenched his fists so tightly that they clenched, and the killing intent in his body came out even more fiercely. Bastards, these bastards deserve to die. Lin Yu said through gritted teeth. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the boss's wife only had a wry smile on her lips, and her eyes were full of helplessness. Yes, they deserve to die, but their leader holds a chaos-level alien beast in his hand. That chaos-level alien beast, even the governors of nearby states and counties, may not be their opponent. What's more, that person is a good person. Their leader and the governor unite and divide it 50-50. Naturally, no one will cause trouble for them, but it will only cause trouble for us. As the boss lady spoke to the end, Her tone became more helpless, and the bitter smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the landlady said, he also started to protest. A bit of gloomy murderous intent flashed in his eyes, and a cold aura began to spread. It doesn't matter, just leave this matter to me. When the time comes, I will definitely seek justice for you. There was quite a bit of determination in the corners of Lin Yu's eyes and brows. At this moment, the killing intent on his body was even more stern. There was quite a bit of determination in the corners of his brows. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the landlady felt suddenly happy, but after a while, she shook her head. Although this girl holds an epic level beast, she can't be that person's opponent. So, young master, you too, don't die here with us. After hearing what the landlady said, Lin Yu only had a faint smile on his lips. At this moment, he still looked calm and composed. The soldiers will block it, the water will cover it, and the soil will cover it. As for the rest, it doesn't matter. The landlady shook her head, but before the landlady could finish speaking, Lin Yu shook his head. Nothing to worry about, just wait for them to come. At this moment, Amelia Su turned around and smiled at the landlady. It doesn't matter, if we leave and they come, their anger will definitely not let you go so easily. You won't be able to deal with it at that time, but Mr. has his own way, and he is much more powerful than me. Su Weiner stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, and Lin Yu didn't say anything at this time. He just took a gentle sip of tea, and then closed his eyes to rest. After seeing this scene, the landlady knew that there was no way to persuade them to change their minds, so at this time the landlady just sighed quietly. Oh, I just hope you don't die from this for a while. Amelia Su just smiled. No, on the contrary, if that guy really dares to come over, I'm afraid he will be the one who loses his life. When the proprietress looked at Su Weiner's confident look, something strange flashed across her eyes and brows. Her eyes were fixed on Su Weiner's body, and her face was slightly condensed at that time. There was quite a bit of solemnity in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, the landlady was thinking, looking at them like this, maybe this little girl really has something to rely on. When the landlady thought of this, she couldn't help but raise her eyebrows slightly, and a strange color flashed in her eyes. At this time, Malu, who had escaped earlier, also arrived at a hilltop, which was heavily guarded. When they saw Malu running over, they just turned their heads and glared coldly at the road. There was a bit of gloom in their eyes, and the murderous intent on their bodies was so cold. Who are you? Tell me your name. The eyes of those people were staring at Malu, and there was a gloomy murderous intent in the corners of their eyes and eyebrows. A cold momentum emanated from them. When Malu felt the terrifying momentum on them, his face suddenly became ugly. At this time, they took a deep breath and calmed down their mood. Brothers, it's me, I'm Malu. Don't you recognize me? Malu's eyes were staring at them, and there was a bit of earnestness in his eyes. When the group of people heard what Malu said, they just turned around, glanced coldly at him, and then sneered. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 509. The group of people took a closer look and glanced coldly towards the road. Then, a mocking smile appeared on the corners of their mouths, and a cold look flashed in their eyes. Who do I think it is? It turns out to be Malu. Malu, could it be that he provoked something outside again? The person who shouldn't have been provoked was beaten back. Those people's eyes were fixed directly on Malu, and there were some meaningful smiles on the corners of their mouths, and there was a bit of mockery in their eyes. At this time, Malu also blushed, and then coughed lightly, turned his head, and stared directly at them. Ahem, what do you mean by that? What do you mean I was beaten back by them? Although Malu was really embarrassed when he said this, so he continued talking. At this time, they were staring at Malu with smiles on their faces, and the sneers at the corners of their mouths became more and more obvious. Although what? Malu, you should come and tell us what is going on. We are also very curious. Those people's eyes were fixed directly on Malu, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and there was quite a bit of mockery in his eyes. At this time, Malu just turned his head and glanced towards them coldly. I'm here to see brother, I'm not here to see you. And at this moment, a lazy voice suddenly sounded from a distance, and then he saw a person with his hands in his pockets and a piece of dogtail grass in his mouth, and then this happened walked out slowly. A meaningful smile appeared at the corner of the man's mouth, and there was a hint of mockery in his eyes. At this time, when Malu saw the person coming, his face turned slightly ugly, and then he couldn't help but subconsciously glance to the side. Why is it you? The man heard what Malu said, and then glanced coldly at Malu, with a slight sneer on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of anger in his eyes. Gloomy meaning. What? Is it possible that I don't welcome your third brother when I see him? Hu Lao-san's eyes were fixed on Malu, with a rather gloomy look in his eyes, and the aura of his body was clearly revealed at this moment. At this time, Malu quickly waved his hand, shook his head, and then nailed Hu Lao-san with a smile on his face. No, of course not. Naturally, I couldn't even be happy when I saw third brother. How could I not welcome third brother? When Hu Lao-san heard what Malu said, he took a step forward, and then came to Malu. He just gently lifted Malu's collar, then his eyes were fixed on Malu's body. But looking at you like this, you seem to be unconvinced by me. At this time, Malu quickly waved his hands and shook his head crazily, even crying a little. After Hu Lao-san saw this scene, he just threw Malu out so casually. His eyes were fixed on Malu's body, and the few points at the corners of his mouth were like this. The sneer became more and more obvious. Ha ha ha, I didn't expect it, Malu, you are really funny. Okay, I'm in a good mood today, so I won't care about you so much for the time being. Get out of here. After Hu Lao-san finished speaking, he pushed Malu away. At this time, Malu took a few steps back, and then managed to stabilize his figure. At this time, Malu's eyes flashed with a bit of gloom. His eyes were fixed on Hu Lao-san, and there was a bit of gloominess in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Meaning? It's just that the gloomy look in his eyes was just a flash. Of course, facing Hu Lao-san, he naturally didn't dare to make too many mistakes, because he also knew how scary Hu Lao-san was. Hu Lao-san just stared at Malu with a smile on his face, and then waved his hand casually. Forget it, look at how useless you are. Now that the eldest brother is in there, but he is in a bad mood, I advise you not to talk to him about these annoying things anymore, because if you really give him if you get too anxious, he might even kill you too. Hu Lao-san's eyes were fixed on Malu's body, and then he spoke softly. At this time, after hearing what Hu Lao-san said, Malu's face seemed to be twisted together. His eyes were fixed on Hu Lao-san's body, and then he followed. He couldn't help but frown slightly. Third brother, what you said is probably true. If it is like this, then I'm afraid. Hu Lao-san just smiled, then knocked Malu on the head, and then spoke in a deep voice. Did you say that your third brother has ever lied to you? Of course it's true, so whether you do this or not, you'd better think it over carefully, otherwise, you may not even know how you died. At this time, Malu nodded his head like a chicken pecking at rice, and there was a bit of fear in his eyes and eyebrows. His face was slightly condensed, and then he sighed heavily. At this time, in this hall, a man was doing this. The man's face was gloomy as if water was about to drip out, and his face was very ugly. At this moment, the man's fists were clenched and creaked, and his eyes and eyebrows were full of gloom. Assholes, these rubbish, how can they do such rubbish things? Why do I raise such a group of rubbish, damn it? The man said this as if he was gritting his teeth, and everyone seemed to have heard it at this time. The man's voice was also the voice that no one dared to step forward without authorization. And at this moment, the man seemed to feel a special breath, and a gloomy look flashed in the man's eyes. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 510. The man's brows seemed to be knitted together. Is Malu back? One of them, after hearing what the man said, nodded heavily, and then glanced in the man's direction, with a bit of confusion in his eyes. Brother, Malu is indeed back. Do you think we should summon him in now? After the man heard what the man behind him said, he just turned his head and glanced in his direction, and then nodded slightly. Call him in. There's something I really want to ask him. There's an aura about him that I hate, but I don't know if it's that person. At this time, after hearing what Shenzingnan said, everyone ran out one after another, and then they called Malu in. After Malu was called in by the group of people, he fell to his knees on the ground. His eyes were fixed on Shenzingnan, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Please, brother, make the decision for me. When Shenzingnan heard this, after Malu said this, his expression also condensed slightly, and then he waved his hand casually. Get up quickly and see what you mean by looking like this. At this time, after hearing what Shenzingnan said, Malu only had a wry smile on his lips, and then he slowly got up, his eyes staring straight at Shenzingnan's body and face also condensed slightly. Brother. Shenzingnan just waved his hand casually. Did you meet a tough guy this time? After hearing what Shenzingnan said, Malu nodded his head like a chicken pecking at rice. At this time, he even had a hint of crying. Yes, this time there is a very hateful guy, that guy. At this time, before Malu could finish speaking, Shenzingnan just waved his hand casually, then turned his head and glared coldly at him, his eyes full of anger. It's a bit gloomy. You don't have to tell me so much nonsense. I'm not in the mood to listen to your nonsense. You just need to tell me where that person is now. Shenzingnan's face turned slightly cold, and there was a bit of gloominess in the corners of his eyes and brows, and the murderous aura on his body was even more awe-inspiring. At this time, after hearing what Shenzingnan said, Malu also had a bitter smile on his lips, and his eyes were full of helplessness. That person is now in an inn at the foot of the mountain. Shenzingnan heard this. After Malu said this, he just nodded slightly, and then waved his hand casually. As soon as the sword energy arrived, it scattered directly towards Malu. Malu, just as he was about to get up and run away, the sword energy directly cut his throat. At this time, Malu's eyes were wide open, and in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, there was a complete sense of helplessness. At this time, there was a look of disbelief between his eyebrows. Malu fell heavily to the ground like this, not knowing whether he was alive or dead. Shenzingnan slowly stood up and walked outside. A generous burial. After seeing this scene, everyone looked at each other in shock. Their eyes were full of fear. No one wanted to follow Malu's footsteps, and no one could really to find out Shenzingnan's temper. The best way to act is to say nothing. Of course they all do that. At this time, Lin Yu was eating food and drinking wine in the inn, but at this moment, a gloomy and cold aura slowly came towards him from a distance. The breath was cold and scary. Lin Yu's expression darkened slightly. At this time, he couldn't help but half squinted his eyes, and then he said something like this. I have a headache. I really have a headache. I didn't expect that I actually came here. At this time, Su Weiner on the side just glanced at Lin Yu, and then shook her little fist, and the smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious. It doesn't matter. If those guys dare to come, my fists will not be a vegetarian. Su Weiner's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and the smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, Lin Yu just waved his hand gently. You are no match for them, they are a pain in the ass. There was not much emotion in Lin Yu's voice, and at this time, after Su Weiner heard what Lin Yu said, a bit of complexity flashed in her eyes. Then if that's the case, what should we do now? Lin Yu also had a slight chuckle at the corner of his mouth, and then he waved his hand casually. Don't be anxious. If soldiers come to block you, if water comes and earth comes to cover you, there will always be a way. 3 black lines appeared on Su Weiner's forehead, and then she sighed quietly. But there's nothing good about it. It's not difficult to deal with them. As long as you find the right way, you can defeat the enemy with one blow. Just watch carefully from the side for a while. You are no match for that guy. After Su Weiner heard Lin Yu say this, a bit of unwillingness clearly flashed in her eyes, and then she shook her head. I don't believe it. I don't believe they can have 3 heads and 6 arms. Why am I not their opponent? Amelia Sue's fighting spirit at this moment was overwhelming. Lin Yu just sighed leisurely. Oh, you little girl, I don't believe anything I say to you. If you say you won't be their opponent, you won't be. Just stand down obediently and everything will be settled, just leave it to me. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he slowly stood up. At this moment, a man suddenly appeared at the door. The man's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Lin Yu's eyes were also fixed on the man. The two of them looked at each other. In contrast, a burst of fire seemed to burst out in the air. At this moment, when the landlady saw the man, her heart tightened.